Hey, everybody. It is a great honor for me to be able to be here today with you to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. And the first question that I want to address is, who was he? Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister. He was from Georgia. He was a father. He was a husband. He was an amazing speaker, and he was a leader of people. He was also a social and civil rights activist, and he was really the leader that we look to when we talk about the American civil rights movement that took place during the 1950s and 60s. He was also the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And really what that was is it was an agency within the headquarters of Atlanta, Georgia. And it was really established to coordinate and assist local organizations that were helping to advance the full equity of African Americans in really all aspects of American life. And so he very much influenced our institutions here in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. had a ton of accomplishments. Like I mentioned, he was the leader of the civil rights movement. He also led the Montgomery bus boycott that was started by Rosa Parks. He was instrumental in the organization of the March on Washington, where he delivered his now famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He also worked very, very closely with John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson to create and then eventually pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was no small feat, you guys. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did a ton for African Americans. Most specifically, it hastened the end of the Jim Crow laws. And for those of you that have studied American history, you know that the Jim Crow laws were essentially laws put in place to keep whites and blacks very separate, especially in public places. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it started to bring about the equality of African Americans in public spaces and in public transportation and restaurants and other public facilities. Also, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 helped to break down the barriers for African Americans in the workplace, and it also banned poll taxes and literary tests that often prohibited African Americans from even voting and having a say in our democracy. So that was really, really key. So what is the overall impact of Martin Luther King Jr. and what does it mean to me? So the first thing I want to mention is that Martin Luther King Jr. has always kind of stood out to me simply because I share a birthday with him. My birthday is on January 15th. And so even as a little girl, I knew that he was just always there. You know, in school on my birthday, we would talk about Martin Luther King Jr. So it stood out to me. But Martin Luther King Jr. did a lot about teaching us. He was a great teacher, you guys. He taught us how to protest peacefully. And I think that's really important for us to think about today, especially, is civil unrest and anger. You know, he knew about civil unrest and anger, but he still taught us how to revolt against those institutions, but in very, very nonviolent ways. He also taught us how to mobilize people to accomplish a massive task, even when people seem to be working against you. And he taught us about bravery. You know, he taught us about right from wrong. He taught us about the equality of human beings. And he not only did all of that, but he taught us how to deal with conflict in a larger context and to rise above it in dignified ways. And that's why I really respect the man.